When I was 2 years old, my dad ran me over with a flatbed truck. Babies don't survive that. Welcome to the Inner Light Companion, a space to personalize your spiritual journey with the 12 sacred intimacies. I'm Tamara Ridge, your companion and guide. Each episode of this podcast explores a facet of connection with the divine, yourself, others, and the world, offering clear markers to recognize, gentle practices to try, and stories that help you grow what's strong and tend to what needs to grow. Move at your pace and use the name for the holy that fits your heart. This isn't therapy or advice. It's a meeting of souls, a place to listen deeply, ask real questions, and remember the wisdom already within you. I invite you now to take a breath. Let's begin. What if the times when God feels most distant are actually invitations to develop unmediated connection? Today, I'm sharing what to do when spiritual intimacy feels impossible and how religious trauma, deconstruction fatigue, and performance spirituality might be blocking the direct relationship that your soul craves. So let me share what that looked like in my own life. But I had a prayer when I was 18 years old. I was Mormon my whole life, and I found myself without my family in Germany. And all I really had was Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. And I'd always been taught that if you read it and prayed about it, you'll find out that it's true. But I also wanted to know if it wasn't true. So this was my prayer. If it's true, show me that, and I'll live by it my entire life. But if it's not, show me that, and I'll find what's true. Now, I know it was presumptuous of me to think that I could find what was true, but I was 18, right? 18-year-olds believe we can do anything. It wasn't until I was 43, with a series of events that had happened in my life, that I found myself leaving Mormonism. And I'll tell you some of those stories as we go on today. But when I left the church, I experienced such a spiritual void. I felt completely cut off from the divine. I wasn't sure if anything I had previously believed was true, including whether or not there was a God, and if God existed, did God care about me? And I also remember at that time believing that I had to start understanding spiritual things from the beginning at age 43, because I literally went from believing that I had all of the knowledge about God and the universe at my fingertips to believing none of the truth that Mormonism's claim. So during those years of searching, before I found my personal spiritual path, I discovered that there are so many, millions even, people that are experiencing exactly what I went through. And for those people, there are some very specific patterns. And today, I want to talk about those patterns. So these are the 4 right now problems that block your experience of spiritual intimacy. Now, if you remember, I talked about it last episode, but I'm going to tell you again today. The definition for spiritual intimacy is the direct lived relationship with the divine that feels loving, safe, and personally responsive. So present in your everyday life, independent of outside approval. The first problem that gets in the way of that is performance spirituality and perfectionism. You know what that looks like. It's being spiritual so people around you could see that you're spiritual. There is some sort of a social exchange that happens between people who call themselves spiritual and lots of different spiritual circles, that there's if other people think I'm spiritual, then I am spiritual. And it's kind of silly, but it's one of the things that keeps us from true spirituality. Other things, perfectionism, saying something like, if I meditate longer, if I pray harder, if I read more spiritual books, if I give more service, then I'll feel connected. I personally think that those are things that we do to try to seek approval. Having spiritual to-do lists that create burnout instead of connection. See, we don't need connection with other people to tell us that we're spiritual. We don't need connection with other people to give us acknowledgement so that we know God. That is a very private, personal connection. And I'll tell you, I've seen it. Like, as a Mormon, I experienced, what do you think, those once a month fast and testimony meetings? Those meetings were held to share your feelings about God, but they were also very intense social pressure for people to stand up and say they believed, to share spirituality, to shed tears that feel like spirit. I've also experienced where in the church, in the Mormon church, we were told not to say no to our bishop. That means, and that's a general thing, right? It's said in the Mormon church, you have to support the general authorities. You have to support the local authorities. That means that when you're assigned a calling, when you're asked to do things, you do them. And I remember myself wanting so badly to be accepted by God that I did everything that the men told me to do. And in spite of it, I started to have these doubts when I started noticing our Relief Society president. She was so burnt out from serving that she got sick. And it took me a long time to learn that God doesn't value you burning yourselves out and rubbing yourself into the dirt, martyr syndrome, to deem you spiritual. Spiritual is a connection with God. There's also this idea that you have guilt when you're missing a practice or you're not doing enough. Again, I think this comes from this idea that we've talked about before, that if you don't believe that your parents accepted you, or you don't believe that the church will accept you, then you're going to have a whole hard time believing God can. I remember sitting with a Catholic priest after I did a life confession, and I had a husband who was treating me badly in spite of my protests and saying I didn't want to do the things that he was forcing me to do. And I called that abusive. And I went to the priest and I gave my life confession. And he said, "You've had too many marriages. God doesn't allow for a fourth marriage. So you have to go into a convent." Right? I wasn't doing enough. I was missing something. I wasn't right. God was no longer going to accept me. That was somebody outside of me telling me their interpretation of who I was. And I think that's part of what happens that gets in the way. We allow our practice to not feel like enough. We allow someone's projections onto us to make us believe we're not enough. We feel like we're not spiritually advanced enough. We compare ourselves in our spiritual life to other people. We forget that other people in their spiritual lives are only showing us the shiniest parts, especially if they're doing that on social media. So we don't want to compare ourselves. But I know for myself, I had to earn, as a Mormon, God's presence through religious performance. I always believed that the spiritual people were somehow endowed with something, like gifted with something that made them special that I couldn't quite grasp. And it included doing things the right way and saying things the right way and being humble enough and giving enough service. There was an exhaustion to trying to be spiritually perfect enough to be accepted. When I was Mormon, I always wanted to work with the young women in the church. Part of the reason was because I had been, in my patriarchal blessing, I had been told that I would work with the youth of the church. And so I really took that to mean that my value rested on a male leader in the church making a decision that I was good enough to serve the young women. Well, that never happened. And because it never happened for a long time, I struggled with the belief that I wasn't good enough. Like, where's the secret code that I have to unlock to believe that I'm good enough for God? That's what I was always looking for. Never found it. So aside from performance, trying to perform and be spiritually perfect, the next thing that gets in the way of your relationship with God, right? So we're talking about spiritual intimacy. How do you develop a day-to-day spiritual relationship with God? Number one is you stop putting your value in other people's hands and start looking at direct relationship between you and the divine. Problem number two is outsourcing your own authority, not trusting yourself. So that is as simple as thinking that you need a teacher or a pastor or a guru to validate that you're spiritual enough. Constantly thinking about asking your other people, or maybe even asking yourself, is this really God speaking to me? We'll talk in one of the upcoming episodes about ways people experience the voice of God. But you can know that you experience the voice of God if you believe you do, if you can feel it, and there's a presence there. You don't need to ask other people. You also want to know that you don't need to follow spiritual trends because everybody else is doing them. Do you need to wear the beads? Do you need to, here's a big one. Does it make you more spiritual if you smoke your house with sage? Because everybody else is doing it. Or can you say, I am a good person. I have a relationship with God. I feel that every day, and I don't use sage. That's the kind of things I'm talking about. What if you doubt your own divine connection because you need other people to confirm it? Or you believe you're not spiritual enough to hear God directly. So I grew up believing that God could only speak through church authority figures. And part of the path between that prayer when I was 18 and leaving the church when I was 43 is I would have these very private, very real experiences of communication with God, where, for example, one of the days I had planned a play date with a friend of mine and her kids, with my kids, up in the mountains. And we were going to go and looking forward to it. The kids were going to be going and playing in the snow. Everyone was excited. And that morning, I got a very strong feeling that I shouldn't go. And it felt like God telling me not to go. And now if I don't go, I'm disappointing both of my girls. I'm disappointing myself. But I really felt a very strong feeling that I needed to not go. Then that very same weekend, we took my car to the dealership for regular scheduled maintenance, and there was a leak in my brake line. And so I think about that, and I think, okay, if I needed someone else to validate the reality that I have a connection with God, then I would have needed someone else to tell me I was right to not go on that trip on the mountains that day. And maybe our lives would have ended because there was a leak in the brake lines. I've had bishops tell me things that were wrong. I've had people ask me to do things that were outside of my capability. And I started to really value that I had a direct relationship with God and I knew what to do. And then a church leader would come and tell me something different. So one of the very, very basic examples I can give you is when I first put the second piercing in my earlobes. So I got my ears pierced when I was 8, and then I think I was 16. No, I was older than that. 24 when I got my second piercing in my ears. And then I went to church general conference, and the prophet said from the pulpit, young women should have no more than 2 piercings, 1 in each ear. You know, I went home and took my earrings out. So that was how committed I was to being acceptable to God through the eyes of man and making sure that my spirituality was performative enough to please the men around me. And yet I still didn't get the calling that made me feel I was worthy enough to serve God. So I think it's really important to understand that ultimately it was a spiritual validation that led me to finally leaving the church. So patriarchal blessings are something that the Mormons really think that the patriarch can speak for God in a very prophetic way. And so they have a ritual of you go to the patriarch, you have sort of a life inventory, and then you're determined that you're worthy enough to have and you're ready, mature enough for your patriarchal blessing. And I got mine when I was 16. And what it said was that I would marry a very good man and that we would have sons and daughters. And actually, this is very emotional for me to share on a platform like this, but I think it's so important. So I didn't have children. I didn't have any children. And the man I married was not a good man. He was emotionally abusive in many of the ways that my mom was also emotionally abusive growing up. And so I divorced that guy after 14 years, and I got married again. I got married the second time because I believed, here if you can hear the story in this, I believed that I didn't have worth in God's eyes unless I was married. That's a very strong Mormon belief, but I really believed it. So I married again the second time, and this was to a Mormon guy who was just stand up in the community and everyone loved him. Behind closed doors, he was a very different dude and really abusive. Asked me one day about my patriarchal blessing, and I said, I don't read that blessing very often because it makes me feel bad about myself. It had all of the promises that were based on a spiritual or righteous life that had been unfulfilled for me. And it really didn't have anything to do with me not being good, but that's what those blessings are about. If you're good, you'll get these blessings. Mormons are really big on be good, you'll get the blessings. And so I let him read my blessing, and he convinced me that I should go to the patriarch and get a new blessing, which is completely unprecedented. It's not something I wanted to do. It took some convincing, and I finally went. I finally went and got the new patriarchal blessing. I had to go through several church leaders, the bishop, the stake president, the new patriarch. We all talked about it. They all read my old blessing. We sat, they prayed, and then they finally decided that Tamara needed a ticket out of the church. That's not what their intention was, but here's what happened. The patriarchal blessing said, your first husband was a bad man, but your second husband is a righteous man. As soon as I got the blessing, as soon as I heard those words, I went, uh-oh, okay, somebody's wrong here. And I remember that was the point where I could not anymore deny the things that I knew that were different from what I was being taught, different from what I was being told. This was a stark example of my own relationship with God telling me, like we'd had experiences where this husband said to me, I'm your husband. You're supposed to do what I say. And I said, I'm only supposed to do what you say if you listen to God, and you don't listen to God, so I don't have to listen to you. It was this man who was very abusive in ways I'm not going to talk about now. But when the second patriarchal blessing said he was a good man, I could no longer ignore that I had intuition and I had a real connection with God and I knew what was right. And finally, after all of those years, God showed me the way out of the church. So honestly, after I left the Mormon church, then I had to really struggle to find my way, find connection with God again. And one of the fundamental things that I learned was that all of the spiritual experiences I had had, all of the deepened knowledge of connection with God that were there for me, were there in spite of my Mormonism, not because of Mormonism. And that really shifted the way I looked at myself, because now I saw myself as connected with God and without religion in between. So external authority can get in the way of a relationship with God, with a spiritual intimacy. Third problem, shame-based image of God. What that looks like is believing that God is punitive, judgmental, essentially just waiting for you to mess up. And you know that because you have these chronic feelings that you're not worthy, no matter how good you are, no matter how many service projects you do, no matter how much money you donate to charity, you're never good enough. You're always making up for who you are. Or a fear-based spirituality. I better pray or something bad's going to happen. Or believing that you're too broken or too sinful for God to fully love you. Seeing God as a distant judge rather than a loving presence. And I would say that I felt this the most during my experience of infertility, because I have, Mormonism also puts the ability to have children in high regard, and I never did. And I was really socialized. I socialized myself hard in the Mormon church. And so I wanted to have children more than anything else. I'm glad now that I didn't, but that's a whole other story. You probably heard about that in one of my previous episodes. But during the 7 years of infertility, I, again, was looking for the the secret rule book where I could figure out what the rule was that was connected to me having children so I could obey that rule. Waiting for God, who was punitive, to find me worthy. But after a while, what happened was I really just believed I was too far into a dark hole to be reached by God. I didn't feel loved. I didn't feel connected. And then when I left the Mormon church, and in that 10 years, I also felt very unreachable. Like there was something about me that made God not want to hold me. But it's really very interesting. I don't know if I've told this story. If I have, I'm going to tell it again. So one of the things that I always wondered about growing up, my entire life actually, the dynamics in my family have never been loving, supportive toward me. There's always been a lot going on behind the scenes that were harmful, to the extent that on the day that I heard that my father had died the day before, and that was almost a year ago. It was December 15th of 2024. So it hasn't even been a year. I got a call from my cousin, and of course, when I picked up the phone, I wanted to know if her dad was okay because her dad had been in the hospital, and she tearfully told me it was my dad. And so my dad apparently went out on the front lawn to check some sprinklers and fell over and was gone. Apparently a emergency responder saw it happened and they called for help, but my dad was already gone by the time any help could arrive. And it's interesting because I was in meditation and prayer thinking about that. I didn't have, like, if it can give you any idea about what my family life has been like, I didn't feel any sadness. I felt relief, no sadness. But I was in meditation and deep prayer that night, and I've had this question my entire life, my entire life. Why was I born to this family? And that night, sitting in meditation, the answer came to me. You were born into this family so that today you would know I've been carrying you the whole time. That shifted everything for me. Instead of feeling lost or feeling like I'm not measured up or feeling like I'm somehow too far in the dark, I looked at all of the events that had happened in my life and I realized how very precious I am. Right? One of the things that happened in my childhood was when I was 2 years old, my dad ran me over with a flatbed truck. Babies don't survive that. And it was right over my middle. And I do have an injury because of it that's lifelong, but I'm alive. And when I was 5, my mother left me alone in the backyard with my little brother. My grandmother's dog was in the next door, and we were playing with him through the fence, or so we thought. And that ended up in me having 36 stitches in my face and throat, and a mother who was too disconnected to realize that she shouldn't leave me for any period of time, but she should just call emergency services. I ended up having 36 stitches in my face and throat. The odds of a child who's 5 surviving that and the things that happened before I got to emergency care, I should not be here. But God said to me through decades of pain and suffering and striving. I've been carrying you the whole time. And I'm not special. Ooh, there's emotion. So the fourth thing that keeps us from having a close relationship with God is deconstruction fatigue, or the residue from religious trauma. So, right, it took me 10 years. And in 10 years, I didn't pray. I didn't know how. I even explored witchcraft for 10 minutes, maybe longer than 10 minutes. But nothing felt like it landed. If you've left harmful religious structures, but you haven't found a nourishing replacement, which I tried to do, then you're dealing with religious trauma fatigue. Feeling a sense of spiritual homelessness. Like, I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere anymore. I felt that. I know what that feels like. And then there's these fears of new spiritual practices because they might be manipulative too. I remember when I was married for the third time. Guys, I'm honest, I've been married 3 times. The third time I married this guy who looked like a spiritual beacon, but not Mormon. Turns out he wasn't. Surprise, surprise. But we were at church, at a church where he pastored. And I remember being so traumatized when the music that a hymn that was being sung in the Sunday service was the same hymn that was often sung at church in the Mormon chapels. I actually had to get up and leave the service, crying because the harm that had been done to me, where I listened to and did things that were harmful to me, the music reminded me that I was sitting again in church and terrified me. So that also looks like not being able to listen to music, not being able to talk about spiritual language without being triggered by trauma memories. And honestly, there is an exhaustion from having to rebuild your entire spiritual framework from scratch. I remember I had done it. I gave up. I had lots of periods of time where I didn't even try. Because having to start to understand spiritual things from the beginning and believing that you don't have it in you innately as a spiritual human being is so painful. It leaves you lonely because you feel like you don't belong in church and you don't belong in non-church places. For me, the turning point came when I discovered Yogananda. So Steve Jobs used to give away that book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, and he'd given away many, many of them. He kept hundreds of copies and personally handed them out to friends, colleagues, guests. I read that book. And when I read that book, it was the first time I heard anyone say, you can have a direct relationship with God with nobody telling you how, with nobody blocking you. You can build your intuition muscle and have direct communication with God without a gatekeeper. That changed my life. It brought peace and harmony to me again. And it's the reason that I now can see myself the way I think God sees me, and have much more ability and belief in myself and willingness to try because I feel supported. But here's what I wish somebody had told me during my darkest spiritual seasons. And what I now say to other people who feel spiritually abandoned, there are solutions. So spiritual intimacy counters the problems because it changes the way you think about things. So where there's performance, now you look for presence. You realize that the relationship is more important than a checklist, and that tiniest moments of connection count. So now instead, it's interesting, when I was doing my spiritual counseling training, I've had periods of time where I've believed that the only way, right? Mormons said, if you want to know God, you have to read the Book of Mormon a half hour a day. I've done that. I've read that book dozens of times. You have to go to the temple every month. You have to pray beside your bed for at least 15 minutes. And then I got caught up in the same kind of thing. And you have to meditate 30 minutes a morning, 30 minutes at night. Guess what? I still meditate about 20 minutes in the morning. But it's those moments of silent prayer that don't have words, moments of quiet where a connection happens. The more often we seek that, the more often we feel the connection. The answer to outsourced authority is inner authority, building that trust in your own direct divine connection, and not having it be important for other people to agree. It's building trust through experiences. Building trust where you allow yourself to be vulnerable with God again and again and again. And then you see or feel or understand that you are held until you don't need anybody else to confirm that for you. And when shame-based belief in God is the thing that you've learned, which I say often, we project our image of our parents onto our image of God. But when we learn that God wants us to belong first, and then we grow because we feel loved, that's what works. And so maybe when you think that you've done something that's going to make God angry with you, think again. I am loved. The relationship is the most important thing. And then if you struggle with deconstruction fatigue, then what you need is gentle reconstruction. Learning to have a direct relationship with God with no gatekeepers. Awareness in your body of the experience you've had of trauma when it comes to God, and starting to challenge those. So it's really interesting because I was such a good Mormon. I was such a good Mormon, you guys. So as a Mormon, I went to the temple when I was 23 without planning to get married and without planning to go on a mission, which is exception. The leadership of the church said, "Are you going on a mission?" "Nope." "Are you getting married?" "Nope." "Well, that's why women usually go to the temple." I said, "I know, but it's my time." So I went. And on the day I went, and everyone who also went that day, they make you feel like you're special, but everybody gets the same new name. My new name was Julia. Now, you have to promise not to share that name. And if you share the name, like consequences, they've changed the temple ceremonies, but it used to be death. So for me, part of my deconstruction, reconstruction was, well, wait a minute, I'm really afraid. I have to keep these secrets. If I don't keep the secrets, God is going to strike me down. So I started telling everyone I knew. My new name in the temple was Julia. My new name in the temple was Julia. Hey, you know what? I'm not supposed to tell my new name, but here's my new name. and no lightning struck me. So I started realizing, wait a minute, the things I believe from fear, and I can challenge those fears so that I can develop a direct relationship with God, because that is what I want and deserve. The breakthrough from me really came when I realized that everything I'd been taught about connecting with God was backwards. Didn't need to be doing big service. Didn't need to be deemed worthy by a man who was counting your tithing. You had to learn to continue to give your heart to God and learn that you're right when you're doing that. I had to wait till I was 53 to learn that unmediated connection with God was possible. But it's made all the difference between feeling spiritually abandoned or fearing spiritual abandonment and really growing into my skin in a spiritual way. And I think other thing to know too is, I think sometimes when we're raised in certain structures, we're raised not to question. And in those moments when I was 18, praying next to that bed in Germany, it was doubt. I didn't want to pray, show me the Book of Mormon is true. That's a response bias. I prayed, if it's true, show me that. If it's not, doubt. Show me that too. And if you ask my opinion, it's the doubt that led me to deeply authentic spiritual intimacy. So I've told you all these stories. So how do you actually build the 7 markers if you can't even feel God's presence? Here are some of the practices that carried me through. One of the ways that you know you are developing your spiritual intimacy is because you start feeling that connection. It's an unmediated, direct relationship with the divine without needing priests, pastors, gurus, or institutions as middlemen. It's just like after the priest told me, he literally told me, no joke, go into the monastery. Go live your life in the monastery. I walked away from that cathedral thinking, there's no way God wants me to feel this bad. There's no way God wants to punish me for the rest of my life for following relationship practices that I learned in an abusive home, or go back to an abusive man because God doesn't allow 4th marriages. Doesn't make sense. So what this practice looks like is that you pray and you meditate directly. You trust that God hears you without an intermediary. You tell God the truth. And you don't need anyone else to interpret your spiritual experiences, because your relationship with the divine is your relationship. It's personal and unique. And you know that you can access the divine anywhere, anytime, without ritual requirements. I literally, so when I was testing my intuition, when I was thinking about this idea that intuition is a muscle that we can build, and we don't have to be specially endowed by being a star child or whatever people talk about. And I thought, I have 3 dogs, and my 3 dogs like chewing on elk bones. And in the last Airbnb we were in, they all disappeared. I couldn't figure out where they went. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to test my intuition. So I sort of silently prayed, help me find the elk bones. And I looked into the couch. They weren't there. I'm going around looking everywhere. And then I hear, look in the couch. And I thought, no, I already looked in the couch. Then it came again, look in the couch. So I pulled the cushions off, and out underneath the cushions, there's that lining that keeps your springs from being exposed. And that was all torn. And I looked in there. What do you think I found? I found the elk bones. I'm like, yeah, okay, wherever we are, if we attune ourselves, if we really want to practice this and explore and unlearn the wrong lessons that teach us that God is inaccessible, we'll learn spiritual intimacy. And during difficult seasons, I've learned this too. I've had my share of difficult seasons when I can't feel God. Then we pray something like, God, I can't feel you, but I'm showing up anyway. I have enough belief because you've shown up before. Or I have enough belief because someone told me that you showed up for them. So here I am testing. Trust that a connection exists even when you don't feel it. For 58 years, I said, why was I born to this family? That prayer wasn't answered for 58 years. So continue your practice even when it feels like you're shouting into the void. Because it's not a void. Sometimes we need experiences. I've shared this before. I know I shared this before. My infertility was an instance of God protecting me. But I didn't see that until just a few months ago, and I'm 59. You can discover that your prayers are just as valid as anyone else's. But sometimes it takes time. Marker number 2 is everyday presence. And what it means is that you find the divine in the ordinary, in quiet moments, instead of just the dramatic spiritual highs or crisis interventions. Sit at a sunset or a sunrise and see if you feel peace. What that looks like in practice. Notice the divine sparks when you're washing dishes, when you're driving, when you're folding laundry. My partner and I were driving in Riverton, Wyoming just a few months ago, and he was getting ready to cross an intersection, and I saw that the car on cross traffic didn't stop and they didn't see us. He didn't see that. So I said, stop! And he stopped, and it averted an accident. And possibly a death. They were in a passenger car, and we drive a very big SUV. And that was a divine synchronicity. Notice that. Notice when you feel held. Recognize God in the small synchronicities, not just in huge miracles. And think of this. Don't compartmentalize your spiritual life to prayer time. Think of it as woven throughout your day. I was walking my dogs this morning and I saw the tiniest little butterfly. And I went, oh, thank you for coming by, butterfly. I also saw another hawk come circling around me. And it's a sign for me that I'm being watched in the best way. In difficult seasons, look for the divine in those present routine moments, especially if you're feeling spiritually dry, and trust that God's in the ordinary, even when you can't feel anything special. And then I would challenge you to journal small moments of the things you notice. Marker number 3, inner authority. It means that you trust your direct spiritual experience, even when other people disagree or they don't understand. So in practice, it looks like you know what God is saying to you, even if it contradicts religious teachings. I would still be Mormon if I hadn't done that. You don't need community consensus to validate your spiritual experiences. They're yours. You can discern what's true for your spiritual path versus what other people think you should be doing. Trust your intuition and your inner knowing, and know that that's divine guidance. And during difficult seasons, honor your spiritual experience, even when you feel alone in it. When you trust this is true for me without needing external validation, you'll feel carried. So stand in your truth even when other people question your path. Marker number 4 is being safe when being vulnerable with God. That means you bring your real self to prayer and meditation, your honest emotions, your doubts, your anger, your confusion, without fear of divine punishment. I wasn't afraid when I said, hey, if this isn't true, let me know that. But also, in my 7 years of infertility, you bet I prayed some angry prayers. Those prayers get answers, even if it takes a long time. So it's okay to pray, God, I'm really pissed at you right now. Bring your messiness, not just your polished spiritual self. Cry and rage and question in prayer without guilt, knowing that God wants all of you, your honesty, all of it. And during difficult seasons, that spiritual struggle, don't hide it from God. Saying, I can't feel you and it hurts, instead of pretending everything's fine, that's the language. Let divine presence witness your pain without needing to fix it. The next marker is having a benevolent view of the divine, and it means experiencing God as loving, nurturing, and trustworthy instead of punitive, distant, or conditional. What that looks like in practice is that you feel God's presence as warmth, safe, supportive, unconditionally loved, no earning required. And then you can start to trust God and approach God without fear. And believe you're held and loved exactly as you are. And in difficult seasons, repeat, I am held, even when you can't feel it. That's what faith is. Trusting because you've been able to trust before, or trusting because you want to feel something different. Challenging your old fear-based God images with new benevolent experiences. Maybe you need spiritual counseling to help you do that. But act as if you're beloved, even when you don't feel worthy. It was me striving to see myself as loved by God when I heard, I've been carrying you the whole time. One night not sleeping, and so I asked Perplexity AI, what are the odds that I should have died? And I described these 2 events that happened. And Perplexity said, it's very unlikely and extremely and highly unusual that you could have survived both of those. No, it was divine intervention. The next marker is relational closeness, and what it means is that you relate to the divine as an intimate friend, a beloved companion instead of a distant authority figure or some judge in the cosmos. What that looks like in practice is talking to God throughout your day like a trusted friend, giving God your thoughts, a feeling of companionship, not just reverence. Your prayers sound more like conversations than formal petitions. And then you experience the divine as personally responsive to you. And during difficult seasons, just keep speaking to the divine as a trusted friend, even when you feel abandoned. Continue the conversation even when you're not getting answers. Trust that the relationship exists, even in silence. And then finally, the last marker to know that you're getting somewhere with your spiritual journey, with spiritual intimacy, is discernment. It's learning to distinguish between divine guidance, your ego, fear voices, and intuition. And what that looks like in practice is that you can tell the difference between your anxiety and divine warnings. And you recognize your own voice versus the Spirit's voice. I always talk about that. It happens in the solar plexus, but it happens different for different people. But you will know when synchronicity is meaningful versus just a coincidence, and you'll trust your ability to discern the truth from spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing is when people try to avoid difficult feelings by saying spiritual things. So during difficult seasons, ask, is this divine guidance or my fear talking? And then journal to track the patterns and how God speaks to you personally, so you start recognizing it when it happens. Seek confirmation when you're not sure without dismissing your initial intuition. So hold it, don't talk about it, seek confirmation from God. So that is the deeper dive into spiritual intimacy. I do not have a guided meditation today because our podcast is already almost an hour long. It'll probably be an hour long by the time I've done editing it. Thank you so much for listening today and staying with me. And if this is meaningful to you and you know someone who it would help, please share. And I'll see you next Tuesday. I'll shout at you next Tuesday. Thanks for listening. As you step into your day, notice which intimacies stirred for you. And then choose one small practice and let it meet you where you are. You want support? Grab the free Sacred Intimacy snapshot. And when you're ready, the full Sacred Intimacy assessment that can guide your next steps. Links are in the show notes. Until next time, walk gently, listen deeply, and trust the light within.